The notebook fell from Timothy Reed's trembling hands, pages scattering across the hardwood floor like white butterflies seeking escape. Anthony Robinson stood in the doorway, his eyes fixed not on the academic papers, but on Timothy's face, reading the fear and longing written there in equal measure. The air between them crackled with 3 months of unspoken words, stolen glances, and the kind of tension that made breathing feel like a conscious effort. "I should go," Anthony whispered. But his feet remained planted on the threshold, as if roots had grown through the soles of his sneakers into the apartment's foundation. Timothy's heart hammered against his ribs. "Should you?" The question hung in the space between them, heavy with implication. Anthony's gaze dropped to Timothy's lips for just a moment, a flicker so brief it could have been imagination, before meeting his eyes again. Something shifted in that look, something that made Timothy's world tilt on its axis. Quote 2. Anthony said, stepping fully into the apartment and letting the door close behind him with a soft click that sounded like finality. Quote 3. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, how a simple notebook delivery had become something else entirely, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, on a Tuesday that had started like any other Tuesday, with Timothy Reed convinced he had his life figured out, and Anthony Robinson still believing he was straight. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Timothy had been dating Patricia Roberts for 8 months, a relationship that looked perfect on paper and felt hollow in practice. She was brilliant, studying pre-med with the kind of focused intensity that Timothy admired, and she laughed at his jokes even when they weren't particularly funny. Their conversations flowed easily enough, covering everything from molecular biology to their shared love of obscure indie films, but something essential was missing. Timothy couldn't name what that something was, only that its absence left him feeling like he was performing the role of boyfriend rather than living it. The morning everything changed, Timothy sat in advanced organic chemistry, half listening to Professor Martinez drone about reaction mechanisms, while his mind wandered to the weekend plans Patricia had made for them. Dinner at that new Italian place, followed by a movie she'd been wanting to see. It should have excited him. Instead, the prospect felt like another item on a to-do list, something to be endured rather than enjoyed. That's when Anthony Robinson walked into the lecture hall. Timothy had seen him around campus before, of course. You didn't miss someone like Anthony, with his easy smile and the way he moved through the world like he belonged everywhere he went. He was the kind of person who remembered everyone's name, who could strike up a conversation with a stranger and leave them feeling like they'd just made a new best friend. Timothy had always admired that quality from a distance, the social grace that seemed to come so naturally to Anthony, while Timothy often felt like he was translating his thoughts into a foreign language before speaking. Anthony slipped into the seat next to Timothy with an apologetic smile, pulling out his notebook and pen with practiced quiet. He smelled like coffee and something else, something warm and cedar-like that made Timothy's concentration scatter like leaves in a windstorm. "Sorry," Anthony whispered, leaning close enough that Timothy could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "Overslept. Did I miss anything important?" Timothy's brain seemed to short-circuit. Anthony's voice was lower than he'd expected, with a slight roughness that suggested he'd just woken up. His hair was still mussed from sleep, dark strands falling across his forehead in a way that made Timothy's fingers itch with that inexplicable urge to brush them back. Quote 6. Timothy managed, acutely aware that he was staring. Quote 7. Anthony grinned, and Timothy felt something flutter in his chest that had nothing to do with caffeine withdrawal. Quote Asayon, quote Sonia, Timothy said, the word coming out slightly breathless. Quote Eshon. For the rest of the lecture, Timothy found himself hyper-aware of Anthony's presence beside him. The way Anthony's pen moved across the page in confident strokes, how he occasionally pushed his sleeves up to reveal strong forearms, the soft sound of his breathing. Timothy had never paid attention to another person's breathing before, but suddenly it seemed like the most fascinating thing in the world. When class ended, Anthony turned to him with that same easy smile. "I'm Anthony, by the way. Anthony Robinson." "Timothy Reed," he replied, gathering his books with hands that felt oddly unsteady. "Timothy," Anthony repeated, like he was testing how the name felt on his tongue. Thanks for sharing your notes. You're a lifesaver. Timothy nodded, not trusting his voice. There was something about the way Anthony said his name that made his stomach flip in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. As Anthony walked away, joining a group of friends who greeted him with the kind of easy camaraderie Timothy had always envied, Timothy remained in his seat, trying to process what had just happened. Nothing had happened, he told himself. A classmate had asked to borrow notes. It was perfectly normal, the kind of interaction that occurred hundreds of times across campus every day. There was no reason for his heart to still be racing, no explanation for why the scent of cedar seemed to linger in his nostrils like a promise. That evening, Timothy sat across from Patricia at their usual coffee shop, watching her review her anatomy flashcards while he pretended to read for his literature elective. The words swam on the page, refusing to form coherent sentences. His mind kept drifting back to the moment Anthony had leaned close to whisper his apology, the way his eyes had crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "You're distracted tonight," Patricia observed, looking up from her cards. "Everything okay?" Timothy forced himself to focus on her face, taking in the concern in her brown eyes, the way she'd tucked her blonde hair behind her ears while studying. She was beautiful, objectively speaking. He should have felt something more than the mild affection that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "Otan," he said, which wasn't entirely a lie. He was tired, bone-deep exhausted from the constant effort of trying to feel things he didn't feel, of wondering why every relationship he had ever had felt like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. Patricia reached across the table to squeeze his hand. The word reconnect hit him like a physical blow. How could you reconnect with someone you'd never truly connected with in the first place? The thought was immediately followed by a wave of guilt so intense it made his chest tight. Patricia was wonderful. She deserved someone who could love her the way she deserved to be loved, with the kind of passion and devotion that Timothy was beginning to suspect he simply wasn't capable of feeling. "Odonen," he said, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. Patricia smiled and returned to her flashcards, satisfied with his response. Timothy stared down at his untouched coffee, wondering what was wrong with him, that he couldn't appreciate what he had. His parents adored Patricia. His friends thought they made a perfect couple, and she was everything any rational person would want in a partner. So why did he feel like he was sleepwalking through his own life? The next day in chemistry, Anthony was already seated when Timothy arrived, this time with 2 cups of coffee balanced on his desk. "Peace offering," Anthony said, sliding 1 cup toward Timothy, "for disturbing your concentration yesterday. I figured you for a dark roast kind of guy." Timothy accepted the coffee, surprised by the gesture. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Anthony said simply, and something in his tone made Timothy look at him more closely. There was an openness in Anthony's expression, a genuine warmth that Timothy wasn't used to receiving from someone he barely knew. The coffee was perfect, strong and slightly bitter with just a hint of sweetness. Timothy found himself wondering how Anthony had known exactly how he liked it, then realized he was overthinking a simple act of kindness. "Thank you," Timothy said. "This is exactly what I needed." Anthony's smile was brilliant. Quote 26. Timothy laughed, surprising himself. Quote 27. Quote counted, Anthony said, and Timothy's breath caught at the casual phrase, at the way Anthony's eyes seemed to linger on his face a moment longer than strictly necessary. They fell into an easy conversation about the upcoming midterm, but Timothy found himself paying more attention to the sound of Anthony's voice than to the actual words. There was something musical about it, a rhythm that made Timothy want to lean closer, to catch every nuance and inflection. When Professor Martinez began the lecture, Anthony pulled out his notebook and began taking meticulous notes. Timothy tried to focus on the material, but his attention kept drifting to Anthony's hands as they moved across the page. He had elegant fingers, long and graceful, with calluses that suggested he played guitar or worked with his hands in some way. Timothy found himself imagining what those hands might feel like, then immediately pushed the thought away, disturbed by its intensity. After class, Anthony lingered as other students filed out. Quote 29, he said, his usual confidence seeming to waver slightly. Quote 30. Timothy's heart did something complicated in his chest. "I'd like that," he said, the words coming out more quickly than he'd intended. Quote 32, Anthony's smile returned, bright and relieved. Great. Are you free Friday afternoon? There's this coffee shop off campus that's usually pretty quiet. Friday works, Timothy agreed, already mentally rearranging his schedule. He was supposed to have dinner with Patricia that night, but surely she'd understand if he needed to study. Quote 35, Timothy nodded, though he'd never been there. The grind had a reputation as more of an artsy hangout than a study spot, the kind of place where local musicians played acoustic sets and the walls were covered with paintings by unknown artists. It wasn't somewhere he would have chosen for studying, but the prospect of spending time with Anthony made any location appealing. Anthony asked, quote 37. Timothy confirmed. As Anthony walked away, Timothy remained in the empty classroom, trying to understand why a simple study session felt like the most significant plan he'd made in months. He told himself it was just nice to meet someone who seemed genuinely interested in friendship, someone whose company he actually enjoyed. But even as he formed the rationalization, he knew it was incomplete, a half-truth that didn't account for the way his pulse quickened when Anthony smiled or the strange disappointment he felt when their brief conversations ended. Friday afternoon found Timothy arriving at the grind 15 minutes early, his chemistry textbook and notebooks tucked under his arm like armor. The coffee shop was exactly what he'd expected. Exposed brick walls, mismatched furniture, and the kind of carefully curated bohemian atmosphere that suggested its owner had strong opinions about corporate coffee chains. A girl with purple hair sat in one corner, sketching in a large pad while nursing what appeared to be her third espresso of the day. Near the window, an older man read a paperback novel, occasionally pausing to scribble notes in the margins. Timothy ordered a coffee and claimed a table near the back, spreading his materials across the scarred wooden surface in an attempt to look purposeful. He'd changed clothes 3 times before leaving his apartment, finally settling on a navy sweater that Patricia had once said brought out his eyes. The choice felt significant in a way he didn't want to examine too closely. Anthony arrived exactly at 3, scanning the room until his gaze found Timothy. His face lit up with that same brilliant smile, and Timothy felt his chest tighten with something that might have been relief or anticipation or both. Perfect spot, Anthony said, sliding into the chair across from Timothy. I love this place. It's got character, you know, not like those sterile chain places where everything looks the same. Timothy nodded, though he'd never given much thought to the aesthetic qualities of coffee shops. He agreed, meaning it more than he'd expected to. Anthony pulled out his own materials, and Timothy noticed that his notebook was covered with small sketches in the margins, little drawings of molecules and chemical structures interspersed with what looked like song lyrics. It was the kind of creative expression that Timothy admired but had never felt capable of himself. You're an artist, Timothy observed, nodding toward the sketches. Anthony glanced down at his notebook and laughed. Not really. I just doodle when I'm thinking. Helps me concentrate, I guess. Do you draw? No, Timothy said, then felt the need to elaborate. I mean, I appreciate art, but I've never been particularly creative. I'm more of a logical, systematic kind of person. Nothing wrong with that, Anthony said, but his tone suggested he didn't entirely agree. Au revoir, son. The comment stuck with Timothy as they began reviewing their notes, comparing their understanding of the material and working through practice problems. Anthony had a way of explaining concepts that made them seem less abstract, more like puzzles to be solved rather than formulas to be memorized. He also had a habit of leaning forward when he was concentrating, close enough that Timothy could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Timothy said after Anthony walked him through a particularly complex mechanism. Quote 48, Anthony shrugged. Quote 49, Timothy did know, though he'd never thought about it in quite those terms. He found himself watching Anthony's face as he spoke, noting the way his eyes animated when he talked about something he was passionate about, the unconscious gestures he made with his hands to illustrate his points. Quote 50, Anthony asked. Quote 51, it was a question Timothy had been asked countless times, and he had his standard answer ready. Graduate school, probably a PhD in chemistry, then research or industry work. It was a sensible plan, one that built logically on his strengths and interests, but sitting across from Anthony, something made him pause. Quote 52, he said, surprising himself with the honesty. Quote 53, Anthony nodded as if this made perfect sense. Quote 54, quote 55, Timothy said, relieved to have someone understand. Dire, quote, Anthony asked, his voice gentle but intent. Quote, the question hit Timothy like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, realizing he didn't know. He could list his accomplishments, his academic record, his relationship status, but those were all external markers. Who was he at his core? What did he want, not for his career or his future, but for himself, right now, in this moment? I don't know, he admitted, the words barely above a whisper. I honestly don't know. Anthony reached across the table and covered Timothy's hand with his own. The contact was brief, barely a few seconds, but it sent electricity shooting up Timothy's arm and made his breath catch in his throat. That's okay, Anthony said softly. Maybe that's what this time is for, figuring it out. Timothy stared down at the spot where Anthony's hand had been, his skin still tingling from the contact. Something had shifted in that moment. Some invisible line had been crossed, and Timothy wasn't sure how to navigate back to safer ground. I should probably get going, he said, though the last thing he wanted was for this conversation to end. I have dinner plans. Of course, Anthony said, beginning to gather his materials. This was really helpful, though. We should do it again sometime. I'd like that, Timothy said, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. As they walked out together, Anthony turned to him with a slightly hesitant expression. Timothy's first instinct was to say no, to retreat to the safety of his routine and his relationship with Patricia. But something about Anthony's expression, hopeful and slightly vulnerable, made him reconsider. He said, Timothy promised, and Anthony's smile was so bright it made Timothy's chest ache. That evening, Timothy sat across from Patricia at the Italian restaurant she'd chosen, pushing pasta around his plate while she talked about her anatomy practical. He was trying to focus on her words, to be present in the moment, but his mind kept drifting back to the coffee shop, to the feeling of Anthony's hand on his and the question that had left him speechless. Who was Timothy Reed? Quote 73. Patricia observed, setting down her fork. Quote 74. Timothy looked up, guilt washing over him as he met her concerned gaze. Quote 75. Quote 76. He hesitated, unsure how to explain the confusion that had been growing inside him for weeks. Quote 7. Patricia nodded, though her expression remained troubled. Quote Ashazian. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Timothy wasn't ready to face. They'd never explicitly discussed their long-term prospects, but there was an assumption of permanence in their relationship, a sense that they were building towards something more serious. Quote 79, Timothy said quickly, then realized how inadequate the response sounded. Timothy met her eyes, seeing the hurt there, the confusion that mirrored his own. Kodesa. Tricia reached for his hand across the table, her touch warm and familiar. The irony wasn't lost on him. His instincts were exactly what he was afraid to trust, the growing awareness that something fundamental was missing from his life, something that had nothing to do with career paths or 5-year plans. You're probably right, he said, squeezing her hand gently. It was easier than trying to explain feelings he didn't understand himself. They finished dinner in relative quiet, Patricia making occasional attempts at conversation, while Timothy struggled with the growing sense that he was being unfair to both of them. She deserved better than a boyfriend who was questioning everything about his life, who couldn't even be fully present during a simple dinner. As they walked back to her apartment, Patricia slipped her arm through his. Do you want to come up? We could watch that documentary I mentioned. Timothy almost said yes out of habit, but something stopped him. Actually, I think I should head home, early morning tomorrow. Patricia nodded, though he could see the disappointment in her expression. Okay, but Timothy, if something's bothering you, you can talk to me about it. We're supposed to be a team, remember? I know, he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. And I appreciate that. I really do. But as he walked home alone, Timothy realized that the problem wasn't that he couldn't talk to Patricia about what he was feeling. The problem was that he was beginning to suspect that what he was feeling had everything to do with someone else entirely. Thursday evening found Timothy standing outside the grind, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets as he tried to work up the courage to go inside. Through the windows, he could see that the usual coffee shop setup had been transformed. The tables had been rearranged to face a small makeshift stage where a young woman with a violin was finishing a haunting melody. The audience was larger than he'd expected, a mix of college students and local residents who looked like they belonged in this world of artistic expression and creative risk-taking. Timothy had never been to an open mic night before. He preferred his entertainment more structured, more predictable. But something about Anthony's invitation had made it impossible to say no, even though every rational part of his brain was telling him this was a mistake. He spotted Anthony near the stage, tuning his guitar while chatting with a girl with short-cropped hair and multiple piercings. Anthony looked different here, more relaxed and confident, like he was in his natural element. He wore a simple black t-shirt and jeans, but something about the way he carried himself made Timothy's mouth go dry. Timothy found a seat near the back, ordering a coffee he didn't really want, just to have something to do with his hands. The violin player finished to enthusiastic applause, and the host, a bearded man in his 30s, took the stage to introduce the next performer. Next up, we have Anthony Robinson with an original composition. Anthony's been a regular here for the past year, and his songs always manage to capture something true about the human experience. Please give him a warm welcome. Anthony took the stage with easy confidence, settling onto the stool with his guitar cradled in his lap. He scanned the audience until his eyes found Timothy, and his face lit up with a smile that made Timothy's heart skip several beats. Anthony said into the microphone, his voice carrying easily through the small space. Quote 92. The opening chords were soft and melodic, Anthony's fingers moving with a practiced ease across the strings. When he began to sing, Timothy felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition so profound it was almost painful. The song was about awakening, about the slow realization that the life you'd been living wasn't truly yours, that somewhere along the way you'd lost track of your authentic self. Anthony's voice was rich and warm, carrying emotions that Timothy felt echoing in his own heart. The lyrics spoke of masks and performances, of the exhaustion that came from trying to be someone you weren't, and the fear of discovering who you really were underneath all the pretense. Timothy found himself leaning forward, hanging on every word, every note. It was as if Anthony had reached inside his chest and pulled out feelings Timothy hadn't even known he was carrying, giving them voice and melody and meaning. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous, but Timothy barely heard it. He was too busy trying to process what had just happened. The way Anthony's words had resonated through him like a tuning fork struck against his soul. Anthony performed two more songs, each one revealing another layer of his artistry, his ability to capture complex emotions in simple, beautiful phrases. Timothy watched, transfixed, as this person he'd thought he knew revealed depths he'd never suspected. After Anthony said, he made his way through the crowd toward Timothy's table, his guitar case slung over his shoulder and his face flushed with the aftermath of performance. Quote 93, Anthony said, sliding into the seat across from Timothy. Quote 94, quote 90, Timothy said, and meant it completely. Quote 96, Anthony's cheeks colored slightly. Thanks. I've been writing songs since high school, but I only started performing them recently. There's something about sharing your work with strangers that's both terrifying and addictive. That first song, Timothy said carefully, it felt very personal. Anthony nodded, his expression growing more serious. It was. Sometimes you don't realize how much you have been hiding from yourself until something forces you to confront it. Their eyes met across the table, and Timothy felt that same electric tension that had been building between them for weeks. There was something in Anthony's gaze, an intensity that made Timothy's breath catch. Do you want to get out of here? Anthony asked quietly. Maybe take a walk? It's a nice night. Timothy nodded, not trusting his voice. They gathered their things and headed outside, the cool evening air a relief after the warmth of the crowded coffee shop. They walked in comfortable silence for several blocks, their footsteps echoing off the quiet residential streets. Timothy was acutely aware of Anthony's presence beside him, the way their hands occasionally brushed as they walked, sending small shocks of electricity up his arm. Quote, Anthony said eventually, his voice careful and measured. Quote, water, quote, the question hit Timothy like a physical blow, so direct and honest that it took his breath away. He opened his mouth to give the automatic response, the socially acceptable answer that would deflect and redirect. But something about the quiet intimacy of the moment, The way Anthony was looking at him with such genuine concern made him pause. He said quietly, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. Anthony stopped walking, turning to face him fully. They were standing under a streetlight, its warm glow casting everything in soft shadows. Timothy stared at him. This person who seemed to see straight through all these carefully constructed defenses. Anthony pressed gently. 1-1. Timothy felt tears prick at his eyes, overwhelmed by the kindness in Anthony's voice, by the way he was being seen and understood in a way that felt completely foreign and desperately needed. I think, Timothy said slowly, I would choose to stop pretending, to stop performing this version by yourself that everyone expects and just be honest about who I really am. And who are you really? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and terror. Timothy looked into Anthony's eyes, seeing encouragement there, and patience, and something else that made his heart race. Timothy whispered. Anthony stepped closer, close enough that Timothy could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Timothy's breath caught in his throat. They were standing so close now that he could see the flecks of gold in Anthony's brown eyes, could count his eyelashes if he wanted to. The air between them felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Quote 117, Timothy said, his voice barely audible. Quote 118 tone. Anthony's eyes searched his face and Timothy saw recognition there, and relief, and something that looked like hope. Timothy, Anthony said softly, reaching up to cup his face with one gentle hand, I've been hoping you'd say something like that for weeks. The admission sent shockwaves through Timothy's entire system. Quote 1. Timothy leaned into Anthony's touch, his eyes fluttering closed at the sensation of skin against skin. I am taken, he said miserably, and I thought I was straight. But being with you, talking to you, it's made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. What does that mean for us? Anthony asked, his thumb brushing gently across Timothy's cheekbone. Timothy opened his eyes, meeting Anthony's gaze directly. I don't know. I'm terrified, Anthony. I've never felt anything like this before, and I don't know what to do with it. We don't have to figure it all out tonight, Anthony said gently. But Timothy, I need you to know that what I feel for you is real. It's not just physical attraction or curiosity. You're funny and kind and brilliant, and when you smile, it makes me want to write songs about it. Timothy felt tears spill over, overwhelmed by the honesty and tenderness in Anthony's voice. He whispered. Anthony leaned forward, resting his forehead against the Timothy's. Then we'll figure it out together. Okay, one step at a time. Timothy nodded, not trusting his voice. They stood like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, existing in a bubble of intimacy that felt both precious and fragile. I should probably get home, Timothy said eventually, though the last thing he wanted was to break this spell. I know, Anthony said, Davey. But he didn't pull away. Quote 134, right? Quote 1, Timothy said without hesitation. Quote where Anthony smiled, and Timothy felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. Quote 137. Timothy nodded, knowing that accepting the invitation was another step towards something that would change everything, but unable to care about the consequences when Anthony was looking at him like he was something precious. Quote 138. Timothy agreed and sealed his fate with a single word. The next morning, Timothy sat in his apartment, staring at his phone and trying to work up the courage to call Patricia. He'd barely slept, his mind replaying every moment of his conversation with Anthony, every look and touch and whispered confession. The memory of Anthony's hand on his face, of the way his eyes had lit up when Timothy admitted his feelings, made his chest tight with a mixture of joy and terror. He needed to end things with Patricia before he saw Anthony again. It wasn't fair to her to continue their relationship when his heart was clearly elsewhere, when every moment they spent together felt like a lie. But the thought of having that conversation, of hurting someone who cared about him, made him feel sick with guilt. His phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Good morning. Want to grab lunch today? I feel like we haven't really talked in weeks. Timothy stared at the message, knowing he couldn't put this off any longer. He called her instead of texting back, knowing he owed her at least that much. Quote 140. Patricia said when she answered, her voice warm with affection. Quote 141. Quote Ward Timothy said, his voice already thick with emotion. Reporter, there was a pause on the other end of the line. Quote 144, quote 145, I quote 146. Timothy spent the 20 minutes before Patricia arrived pacing his apartment, rehearsing what he was going to say and discarding every version as inadequate. How did you tell someone you cared about that you'd been living a lie? How did you explain that you discovered something about yourself that changed everything? When Patricia knocked, Timothy's hands were shaking as he opened the door. She took one look at his face and her expression shifted from concern to something approaching fear. What's wrong? She asked, stepping into the apartment. Timothy, you're scaring me. Sit down, Timothy said gently, leading her to the couch. Please. Patricia perched on the edge of the cushions, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Just tell me. Whatever it is, just say it. Timothy took a deep breath, meeting her eyes directly. I think we should break up. The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Patricia's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, hurt, and finally a kind of resigned understanding. She said quietly, it wasn't a question. Timothy's instinct was to deny it, to soften the blow somehow, but he owed her honesty. He said simply. Patricia nodded slowly, tears beginning to form in her eyes. And quote 155, quote 156, Timothy said quickly. Quote 157 or quote 158. Timothy ran his hands through his hair, struggling to find the right words. Quote 159. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. Quote 160, she said finally. Quote 161. Timothy felt his own tears start to fall. Quote 100, quote, she said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. Quote 160. Timothy hesitated, knowing that this revelation would hurt her even more. Quote Watson. Patricia's eyes widened with understanding. The one you've been studying with? Yes. She was quiet for another long moment, processing this information. So you're gay? I don't know, Timothy said honestly. I've never questioned my sexuality before. But being with Anthony, talking to him, it's made me realize that I've never felt for anyone what I feel for him. Maybe I'm gay, maybe I'm bisexual, maybe labels don't matter. I just know that what I feel for him is real in a way that nothing else has ever been. Patricia nodded slowly. That must be confusing for you. Timothy was struck by her grace, her ability to show compassion, even in the midst of her own pain. It is. I feel like I'm discovering who I am for the first time. And it's terrifying and exciting and overwhelming all at once. I hope you'll be happy, Patricia said, and Timothy could tell she meant it despite her tears. I hope you'll figure out who you are and find what you're looking for. I hope you'll be happy too, Timothy said. You deserve someone who can love you the way you deserve to be loved. They talked for another hour, working through the practical details of their separation, the belongings that needed to be returned, the mutual friends who would need to be told. It was painful but necessary, and Timothy was grateful for Patricia's maturity and understanding. After she left, Timothy sat alone in his apartment, feeling hollowed out and raw, but also strangely lighter, as if he'd been carrying a weight he hadn't realized was there. He'd hurt someone he cared about, and that knowledge would stay with him, but he'd also been honest in a way that felt revolutionary. He looked at his phone, seeing a text from Anthony. Quote, 177 Timothy typed back. Quote, 178. Anthony's apartment was smaller than Timothy's, but infinitely more interesting. The walls were covered with artwork, a mixture of Anthony's own sketches and pieces by local artists. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with everything from chemistry textbooks to poetry collections to biographies of musicians Timothy had never heard of. A guitar stood in one corner, and sheet music was scattered across a small desk near the window. Welcome to my chaos, Anthony said, leading Timothy inside. I know it's not much, but it's home. I love it, Timothy said, and meant it. The space felt alive in a way his own sterile apartment never had, full of personality and creative energy. Anthony made coffee while Timothy examined the artwork on the walls, pausing in front of a charcoal sketch of two figures embracing. There was something achingly tender about the piece, the way the artist had captured the vulnerability and intimacy of human connection. That's one of mine, Anthony said, appearing beside him with two steaming mugs. I drew it after watching an old couple at the park. They'd been married for 50 years, but they still looked at each other like they were falling in love for the first time. Timothy accepted the coffee, their fingers brushing as he took the mug. It's beautiful. You're really talented, Anthony. Thanks, Anthony said, his cheeks coloring slightly. I've been thinking about maybe minoring in art, but I keep talking myself out of it. Practical considerations, you know? Maybe practical isn't always the most important thing, Timothy said, thinking of his own recent revelations. Anthony studied his face. You look different today. Lighter somehow. Timothy took a deep breath, knowing it was time to share what he'd done. Quote 29. Anthony's eyes widened, his coffee mug freezing halfway to his lips. You did? I couldn't keep pretending, Timothy said simply. It wasn't fair to her, and it wasn't fair to me. She deserves someone who can love her completely, and I'm not that person. Anthony set down his mug, his hands shaking slightly. How do you feel? Scared, Timothy admitted. Guilty, but also relieved, like I can finally breathe properly for the first time in months. Anthony reached for his hands, intertwining their fingers. I'm sorry you had to go through that. It couldn't have been easy. Timothy looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how right it felt. It wasn't, but Anthony, I need you to know that I didn't break up with her for you. I mean, my feelings for you made me realize that what Patricia and I had wasn't real, but I ended it because it was the right thing to do, not because I was expecting anything from you. What if I want you to expect something from me? Anthony asked softly. Timothy's breath caught in his throat. Quote 129. Anthony lifted one hand to cup Timothy's face, his thumb tracing along his cheekbone. I'm saying that I've been falling for you since the first day we met. I'm saying that every conversation we've had, every moment we've spent together, has only made me more certain that what I feel for you is real. Anthony, Timothy whispered, leaning into his touch. I'm saying that if you're willing to take a chance on this, on us, then I want to explore what this could be. I know it's scary. I know it's complicated. But Timothy, I think we could be something beautiful together. Timothy felt tears prick at his eyes, overwhelmed by the tenderness in Anthony's voice, by the way he was being offered everything he'd been afraid to want. I'm terrified, Timothy said honestly. I've never been with a man before. I don't know how to do any of this. Neither do I, not really, Anthony said. I've had feelings for guys before, but I've never acted on them. You're the first person who's made me want to be brave enough to try. Timothy stared into Anthony's eyes, seeing his own fear and hope reflected there. Quote 270, Anthony countered. Quote 299. Timothy felt something shift inside his chest, a door opening that he'd kept locked for so long, he'd forgotten it existed. Quote to it, he whispered. Quote to him, Anthony's smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. Are you sure? No, Timothy said honestly, but I'm sure about you. I'm sure about how you make me feel. How you make me want to be braver and more honest and more myself than I've ever been. Anthony leaned forward, resting his forehead against Timothy's. Quote 215, quote, he asked softly. Timothy's heart hammered against his ribs. Yes, he breathed. Anthony's lips were soft and warm against his, the kiss gentle and questioning at first, then deeper as Timothy responded with a hunger he hadn't known he possessed. It was nothing like kissing Patricia, nothing like any kiss he'd ever experienced. This felt like coming home and setting sail at the same time, like finding something he'd been searching for without knowing he was looking. When they broke apart, both breathing heavily, Anthony rested his forehead against Timothy's. He whispered. Timothy agreed, his voice shaky. Tom. They sat like that for a long moment, holding each other, breathing the same air, existing in a bubble of new possibility. Timothy felt like his entire world had shifted on its axis, like everything he'd thought he knew about himself had been rewritten in the space of a single kiss. What happens now? Timothy asked eventually. Now we figure it out together, Anthony said, echoing his words from the night before. We take it one day at a time, one conversation at a time, one kiss at a time. Timothy smiled, feeling lighter than he had in months. I like the sound of that. Good, Anthony said, pressing another soft kiss to his lips. Because I plan on kissing you a lot. Timothy laughed, the sound surprising him with its genuine joy. I think I can live with that. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Anthony told him about the first time he'd realized he was attracted to men, the confusion and shame he'd felt, the long process of accepting that part of himself. Timothy shared his own journey of self-discovery, the growing awareness that something was missing from his life, the relief of finally understanding what it was. As the sun began to set, painting Anthony's apartment in golden light, Timothy realized that for the first time in his life, he felt completely himself. Not the version of himself he thought others wanted to see, not the carefully constructed persona he'd been performing for years, but his authentic self, messy and uncertain and real. I should probably head home, Timothy said reluctantly as darkness fell. I have an early class tomorrow. Of course, Anthony said, though his disappointment was clear. But Timothy, can we do this again tomorrow and the day after that? I want to spend time with you, get to know all the parts of yourself you've been hiding. Timothy felt his heart swell with affection and gratitude. I'd like that very much. Anthony walked him to the door, pulling him into another kiss that made Timothy's knees weak. He murmured against his lips. Quote, Timothy replied, feeling like he was floating as he made his way home. That night, Timothy lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the day. The conversation with Patricia, painful as it had been, felt like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. The time with Anthony, the kisses they'd shared, the promises they'd made to figure things out together, felt like the first pages of a story he was excited to write. He thought about Anthony's question from weeks ago. Who was Timothy Reed? For the first time, he felt like he might actually know the answer. He was someone who was brave enough to be honest about his feelings, someone who was willing to take risks for the possibility of real love, someone who was finally ready to stop pretending and start living authentically. It was terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely right. 3 weeks later, Timothy stood in Anthony's kitchen, watching him make pancakes while humming one of his original songs. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm over the past weeks, spending most evenings together, talking and laughing, and discovering each other in ways that felt both new and familiar. Timothy had worried that the transition from friendship to romance would be awkward, that they'd lose the easy connection they'd built. Instead, it felt like they'd simply removed a barrier that had been keeping them from being completely themselves with each other. Anthony said without turning around, amusement clear in his voice. Quote 235. Timothy corrected, moving to wrap his arms around Anthony's waist from behind. There's a difference. Anthony leaned back against him, and Timothy marveled at how natural this felt, how right it was to hold someone he cared about while morning light streamed through the windows. I have something to tell you, Anthony said, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. Oh? Timothy asked, pressing a kiss to the back of Anthony's neck. Quote 239. Timothy felt a surge of pride and affection. Quote 24. Quote 241. Anthony admitted. Quote 242. Timothy understood completely. Over the past weeks, he'd found himself making similar changes, small acts of authenticity that felt revolutionary. He'd changed his major to include more creative writing courses, something he'd always been interested in but had dismissed as impractical. He'd started attending Anthony's open mic nights regularly, even working up the courage to share some of his own writing. I'm proud of you, Timothy said, meaning it completely. Anthony turned in his arms, pancake spatula still in hand. I'm proud of us, he said. Look what we've built together. Timothy looked around Anthony's kitchen, taking in the coffee mugs with their names written in permanent marker, the grocery list on the refrigerator in both their handwritings, the photograph from their first official date tucked into the frame of a mirror. It wasn't just Anthony's space anymore. It was theirs, a home they'd created together. I love you, Timothy said, the words coming easily now, though they'd been terrifying the first time he'd said them 2 weeks ago. I love you too, Anthony replied, setting down the spatula to cup Timothy's face in his hands. Quote 240. Timothy leaned into the touch, thinking about the notebook that had started it all, the simple excuse that had brought Anthony to his door and changed everything. He'd thought he'd known who he was, thought he'd had his life figured out. Instead, he discovered that the most beautiful love stories were often the ones that caught you completely off guard, that forced you to rewrite everything you thought you knew about yourself. Quote 249. Timothy said softly. Quote 250. Anthony smiled, that brilliant expression that had first made Timothy's heart skip beats. Then we're both exactly where we need to be. As Anthony kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise, Timothy thought about the journey that had brought them here. The confusion and fear, the painful honesty and brave choices, the gradual discovery that love wasn't always what you expected it to be. Sometimes it was something completely different, something that challenged everything you thought you knew about yourself and offered you the chance to become who you were always meant to be. The notebook still sat on Timothy's desk, its pages filled with chemistry notes and equations that seemed less important now than the story they represented. It had been such a simple thing, Anthony offering to return borrowed notes, but it had opened a door that neither of them could close. Timothy was grateful for that door, for the courage it had taken both of them to walk through it, for the love they all found on the other side. Outside, spring was giving way to summer, the campus coming alive with the energy of students who were preparing for finals and looking forward to new adventures. Timothy and Anthony had made their own plans for the summer, a road trip to visit Anthony's family and introduce Timothy as his boyfriend, a prospect that both terrified and thrilled Timothy in equal measure. The pancakes are burning, Anthony murmured against Timothy's lips, though he made no move to pull away. Quote 253. Timothy said, deepening the kiss. Quote 254. Anthony laughed, the sound vibrating against Timothy's mouth. Is this what domestic bliss looks like? Burning breakfast and making out in the kitchen? If it is, I'm okay with it, Timothy said, meaning it completely. They did eventually rescue the pancakes, sitting at Anthony's small table to eat them while planning their day. Timothy had a literature exam to study for, and Anthony wanted to work on a new song he'd been composing. But first, they had this moment, this quiet morning together, this ordinary miracle of loving someone and being loved in return. As Timothy watched Anthony pour syrup on his pancakes, gesturing animatedly as he described his ideas for the new song, he felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. Gratitude for the confusion that had led him to question everything he thought he knew about himself, for the courage to end a relationship that wasn't serving either person involved, for the willingness to take a risk on something unknown and potentially beautiful. Most of all, he felt grateful for Anthony, for his kindness and patience, and the way he'd made it safe for Timothy to discover who he really was. Timothy had spent so many years performing a version of himself that he'd thought was expected, but Anthony had seen through all of that to the person underneath, the person Timothy was only just beginning to know and love. Quote 257. Anthony asked, noticing Timothy's contemplative expression. Just how different everything is from a few months ago, Timothy said. How different I am. Do you miss it? Your old life? Timothy considered the question seriously. There were aspects of his previous existence that had been simpler, certainly. The certainty of knowing exactly what was expected of him, the comfort of following a predetermined path. But that simplicity had come at the cost of authenticity, of genuine happiness, of the possibility of real love. No, Timothy said finally. I miss the certainty sometimes, but I don't miss feeling like I was sleepwalking through my own life. I don't miss pretending to be someone I wasn't. Anthony reached across the table to take his hand. And now? Now I feel awake, Timothy said simply. For the first time in my life, I feel completely awake. Anthony smiled, bringing Timothy's hand to his lips to press a gentle kiss to his knuckles. Motuek, he said. Otutaden. Timothy felt his heart swell with love and possibility. The future stretched out before them, uncertain but full of potential. They would face challenges, he knew. Coming out to their families, navigating a world that wasn't always accepting of their love, figuring out how to build a life together when they were both still discovering who they were as individuals. But they would face those challenges together, with honesty and courage, and the kind of love that made everything else seem manageable. Timothy had learned that the most frightening dares often led to the most beautiful discoveries, and he was ready for whatever came next. As they finished breakfast and prepared to start their day, Timothy caught sight of himself in the mirror by Anthony's front door. The person looking back at him was the same in all the physical ways, but there was something different in his eyes, a light that hadn't been there before. It was the light of someone who had stopped hiding, who had chosen authenticity over comfort, who had found love in the most unexpected place. Timothy Reed had finally figured out who he was, and he was exactly where he belonged. The notebook had been returned weeks ago, its original purpose fulfilled. But the story it had started was just beginning, a love story that had caught them both completely off guard and offered them the chance to become who they were always meant to be. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that forced you to rewrite everything you thought you knew about yourself, Timothy reflected as Anthony took his hand and they walked out into the bright morning together. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you found someone willing to help you write that new story, one honest moment at a time.